I'm Martin Cousins, and I'm sorry I can't be with you in the room today. So what I've done is put together this little introduction, and I've also got a slide deck with some voiceover. So I'm going to talk you through some of my thinking based on my practice as a journalist, and also how I've developed my thinking running my own business, providing content and communications for different organisations. So developing stories. One thing I haven't done is look at how we can mine the web and networks for ideas and pick up story ideas. That's probably something that we could talk about separately. But today it's about tools and approaches to developing a story. And when we get to the end of the slides that I've got to show, there's some questions which I'd like you all to consider, think about, talk about, and look at how you might weave some of your thinking into how you develop your stories. I've also got a Twitter hashtag. So this is it, Story Promote. And I will hopefully be able to tweet some stuff from where I am. Otherwise, I'll be adding in some questions that I put at the end of my slides. So looking forward to hearing what you get up to, and I'll see you next week. Welcome to this presentation on developing stories. I'm Martin Cousins. I run a content and communications agency called itsdevelopmental, which is about 4 years old. And I also run a small media site called LearnPatch, which curates and creates content and does events for people in corporate learning and development. Now, in this presentation, I'm going to spend half my time looking at where I've come from and my practice and the skills that I use to develop stories, and half of it just looking at some of the approaches that you can use and some of the tools that you might be wanting to look at to develop your stories. In terms of my development, I left college thinking I wanted to be a curator of photography exhibitions, and after 6 months of being unemployed realised that that wasn't going to happen. So I got myself a job in a publishing company where I had my eyes opened to everything that publishers did, and I hadn't really thought about it until that point, and I really liked what I saw. So I started as a picture researcher, and then I managed to work my way up and around to include writing, editing, commissioning, and being a web editor, running big magazines, doing all sorts of interesting things. And I was there also at a time when business went from print to online, and that happened very quickly. And that actually is a really important part of where I've come from, which is not the bed, as this picture might suggest. This picture represents the shift, I think, the fundamental shift from print to online content. It used to be that when you worked on a magazine, when you got to the end of the process of putting all the pages together, you do the front page last, and then you would do what was known as put the publication to bed. It would signify it going to the printers, getting printed, and it was all over for the week or the day, and then you'd come back the next day and you start all over again. However, now we are digital. That has been turned on its head, and that process, rather than us publishing something and it being the end of what we do, it is now the start of what we do. And that means that we publish and then things start to happen. And I think that's a different mindset. And that also involves us using different skills to tell our stories. So I'm going to tell you a bit about how I use that approach in what I do. So back to LearnPatch. One of the hot topics for my readers and kind of user base is curation, the curation of content and how people can learn and make sense of stuff from everything that's available online. So I thought I would start looking at that topic by asking people what they thought of it. And I did this in a rather basic way in terms of basic tools. I used a Google document, and you can see that I split it into 3 columns just to get people's names and get their views. Now, whilst that was happening, I also went to a big conference, and I thought I'd capture some video of people to find out what they thought about curation too. And I might add, the reason I was looking at curation also is that I had been invited to talk at an event about the topic. So I thought this is why I would use these techniques. So I had some video, and I had some comments coming in on this Google document. And I put them all together and made a 7 or 8 minute video, which I then played at the event. Interestingly, at that event, I heard someone called Sam talk about how he was using curation in his company. And that was a great story for LearnPatch. So I interviewed Sam, and I then had myself a really good story for LearnPatch. So my initial, I'm going to ask a question online, gave me lots of answers, which I took to an event. And whilst at the event, I then got another story. But it didn't stop there. I thought I would then use all this content and these ideas and try and create an event. So I used a tool called Eventbrite, which is a really good and cheap, almost free tool to help manage events and sell them and promote them. And I put on an event, a bar camp event. So it's in a bar at the end of a big 2-day conference in London. And some of the speakers came from those people that added stuff to that Google document. And whilst that was coming together, that event, one of the speakers created a hashtag for the event and started tweeting on that. So we created quite a buzz before the event. And then at the event, one of the speakers even turned up, and he was wearing some of the message, so he was actually he'd put some of the content on his t-shirt too. So then we had our own event. So we started with this Google Doc, which led to us at an event, led to a story for LearnPatch, which led on to another event. And it didn't stop there. Sam and I became good friends. We set up a company, and we ran a massive open online course, which we had 600 people through, on how to be an effective digital curator. So I'm telling you this story because this was an example of how I developed a line of inquiry which became not only a story, it became many things. And I think that's the potential in how we work. So we're just going to stop, and we are going to have a quick intermission before we come back. So there we go. Part 2. We were talking about in the first part about kind of facilitating conversation, and I see this as a really important part of how to develop stories. So it's all about oiling the wheels of communication. And in Yiddish weddings, there's a term for a guy. There's a guy called a tumler. He's the person that gets people up and dancing. Now, I think that's what we are here to do. We are here to use the various social tools that we have at our disposal online to really get people responding to our questions and helping develop stories. Now, there are lots and lots of different tools. I mean, I've talked about some of them, and when I first did this presentation a couple of years ago, we created a hashtag called Story Promote, which we are using for this event too, so please do use it. And I created a Google Doc in the way that I had done before, and I used Twitter to pull people to that document, and it kind of got a life of its own. And I think I'm coming back to these two tools, Google Docs and Twitter, only as an example of the thinking. So there are plenty of other tools out there. You might be using Instagram, you might be using Pinterest, Snapchat, Facebook, you might be using LinkedIn. But what we need to be doing here is understanding how we can use them to show people where the discussion is and create a place of discussion. So hashtags are really important. So you can check into the hashtag. Then you can use tools like Storify to then take the tweets back out and almost not archive them, but create stories out of the conversation that's been taking place. So I think that I'm not going to go into detail about the particular tools. It's more about the mindset and finding the tools that will do what you need to do, what you need them to be able to do. But also, a really, really important factor in all of this is using tools that your audience use. So you want to generate content and put it in the places, in the way that your audience wants to receive it. So if you have lots of people on LinkedIn, then maybe you can think about developing stories in LinkedIn to start with, or the same on Instagram, the same on YouTube even. You don't have to use the tools that they use themselves in terms of consuming the content, but you might like to be thinking about how they consume the content so that you can, clearly produce the stuff in the right way and put it in the right place at the right time. That's really, really important. So if you could use Story Promote today, I'm sorry I'm not in the room, but if you can use that to discuss some of the following questions, then I think something really useful could come out of this, and I will pull them together as well. So I like to think of this as the start of something, never the end. And I've got a few discussion points that I would like everyone to be thinking about ahead of developing your own stories. So these are really important and fundamental. Who is your audience, rather, and what interests them, and how do you know that? How would you find out what people are actually responding to online? What type of content does your audience want? How do they want it? What kind of formats? And what story ideas do you have that will catch your audience's attention? So we'll put these up on the screen so you can be thinking about these. And the second area of discussion are what tools you're going to use and why. So think about the tools you want to use to develop your stories, and what formats you would develop content to. So, because the tools you use can sit alongside the format. Clearly, if it's going to be video, then, and you're going to put it on YouTube, then would you just use YouTube app on your phone, do the whole thing on your phone and just upload it like that? Maybe you would. Would you use Vimeo? I don't know. It's worth thinking about. And I also would like you to think about a great example that already exists, something that, an area of the content that you're looking at that is already good, a good example, and look at what makes that so engaging and useful and good for the readership, and then see if you can build on that. So look forward to seeing you next week, and I hope that's been useful.